Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, my wingman in everything therapeutic, Ken. How you doing, Ken?
Hey, great to be here, Rory. And this is episode 107 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. And a great episode that we have today. Really interesting. Rory and I have just been chatting over the topics before going live, and really nice and meaty. Think you're going to like it. Starting off with working with intrusive thoughts in the therapy room, examining them in ourselves, examining what they are, how to work with those. And then we're going into practice matters and a really interesting topic, emergency phone calls, Rory.
Yes, I'm going to be explaining why counselling isn't a blue light service and what we might have to think about with clients who may need support between sessions.
Like it. And if you're wondering what's a blue light service, think of roo, 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 and a blue light flashing on an emergency vehicle as it's going past. You're going to get a lot out of that one. That's in Practice Matters. We're going to be ending episode 107 today by looking at group supervision. What is group supervision? How does it differ from personal one-on-one supervision? So let's start off looking at that working with intrusive thoughts. What are intrusive thoughts, Rory?
Well, let me just recount a Radio 4 episode of All in the Mind, which is a BBC's podcast about matters of mental health, and they were talking about intrusive thoughts to a psychiatrist, and the presenter asked the psychiatrist the exact same question, Ken, that you just asked me, and the psychiatrist said, "I'll give you an example. I was stood on the tube, on the platform of the tube, waiting, which is a train service, underground train service for those people might be listening in the UK, waiting for the train to take me to the BBC where the thing was being recorded, and there was a woman stood in front of me, and the psychiatrist said, the thought came into my mind, should I push her in front of the train? And there was a bit of a silence as the interviewer kind of tried to process that. And the fact of the matter is that we all have intrusive thoughts, and they're just kind of they're sometimes called in CBT automatic negative thoughts. Stuff comes up in our minds occasionally, which is horrible, and it's just part of being human. And I used to teach automatic negative thoughts to my students, and I would share mine. And one of them was, if I'm going home from college, occasionally it flashes past my mind, shall I drive down the motorway, the highway, on the opposite side? And people used to look at me as if I was, sectionable. But there'd be one or two people in the group who would breathe relief and go, so that's quite normal to have these thoughts. And I'd say, yes, but a lot of people do have them. However, there's a big difference between having a thought and acting on a thought. That's the key thing. And people go away relieved. In fact, I wrote a blog post a few years ago on intrusive thoughts, and someone actually wrote in response, I thought I was going crazy.
I think that is the crux of this, is that it is natural, it is human to have thoughts that we don't act on, that are not acceptable to self. So, Rory, when you talking about you have that thought flash through your mind of driving up the motorway the wrong way into oncoming traffic, that is, well, it's a life-threatening thought that you're having there, and doesn't mean if we have these intrusive thoughts that we agree with them, that they are our will of things that we want to do. They can be the exact opposite of our will. They can be kind of almost compelling us or suggesting something that would lead to our own destruction, the destruction of others, great unhappiness, and it doesn't mean that it is our wish when we have those thoughts. And I think that is the reason why they are so unacceptable to self, why people would breathe that sigh of relief reading your blog post and going, oh, I've had thoughts like this and I've never been able to tell anyone. And I think this is the crux of it. I've never been able to tell anyone. They are often held secretly within self because we can't accept it. Oh, I can't tell anybody that. They'll think I'm mad. If I tell them I sometimes think of driving up the wrong side of the road, but we all have them at some level or degree. And when a client brings that into a therapy room, there is great opportunity to work with that in a normalizing manner, Rory.
Absolutely. And, the first thing is to normalize it and say, help the clients understand that this is just a normal process of owning your brain. It might also be that there's something that you need to pay attention to. So if you're having a lot of intrusive thoughts, it could be there's something that you need to look at. Maybe there's something around anxiety or something that's going on in your life. So you may have to have a look at it. And also take them less personally. It's as always, it's actions that dictate what we do. Thoughts are just things that just go around in our heads. We can think anything. It's actually actions, what we do, that could cause difficulties or not, as the case may be, and also helping clients make them less fearful of the thoughts. And I think there's a caveat here, Ken. If a client comes and says, I've got a thought about killing myself, then you have to consider looking at looking at risk. And basically, and this isn't a training course by any stretch of the imagination, people may need to get some CPD on working with people who may be thinking of taking their own lives. But you need to kind of think about, how often does this thought come? Is there a plan around it? Has someone tried to take their life before? Are there any kind of other aspects, such as drug or alcohol use? And once you've taken those into consideration, then you can consider maybe what your next step is. But generally speaking, these thoughts, they are just, they're just thoughts. And the biggest thing that I've come to know through my life is just accept them. Just accept that they're part of your personality, that there's something that they're just fired up randomly, and have some fun with them. I was talking to a friend the other day, and we were sharing our thoughts, and some of them are quite dark. We ended up just laughing out loud at the nonsense that our brains can throw up from time to time. So just to be clear, if anybody's driving down the road near where I live, I'll be on the right side of it.
Or the left side, actually, because we're in the UK. See, already, the subconscious is influencing you, Rory. I liked your description then. We need to identify, specifically if a client is bringing in these intrusive thoughts, we need to identify that it is an intrusive thought. And the very nature of an intrusive thought is it tends to come from nowhere. It is not planned. It is not premeditated. You're going about your business, not thinking about anything in particular, and suddenly there is a strong thought that just falls into your awareness. That would categorize an intrusive thought. If somebody has been planning something, as you mentioned, Rory, maybe harming their self in some way, and that this has been with them some time, they keep on thinking about it, they keep on going back to that. That is less an intrusive thought and more a developing thought. Needs to be worked on in a different way. There is a lot of information out there. You can kind of do a little bit of CPD on that for yourself, for your clients. In fact, running on BBC television at the time that we make this podcast, which is in March of 2019, there is a television program, just a drama. It's called Pure, and it is about a young person with OCD, and it is full of intrusive thoughts where you actually see the imagery of those intrusive thoughts, and you can see how potentially life-wrecking they can be for some people when they're taken literally and they're measured against, am I like that? Am I thinking these things? Is there something wrong with me? So a really important topic and definitely worth looking at. And I know that happens to me all the time. And sometimes an intrusive thought will bring with it feelings. I may have a memory or a thought from the past of something said and done out of nowhere, driving my car, listening to the radio, will fall into awareness with a little tinge of pain of a little regret, almost a skeleton falling out of the closet. I guess that would be a different kind of intrusive thought because that's coming from a past actual event, where an intrusive thought generally comes from subconscious and is like a dream, doesn't have to relate to reality much.
Yes, absolutely. And if you get a lot of them, it may be thinking about what's going on in your life at the time. If they all of a sudden start to get more intense, or you get in them more frequently, maybe there's some form of anxiety going on. maybe worth just exploring that in your own therapy. And the other thing is, don't alter your behaviours. I mean, when my brain throws up the driving on the, I'll use the word opposite side of the road, I don't stop driving my car. And that's the thing, it is actions. So, if you're working with a client who has these thoughts, sometimes just normalizing them is useful. But just be aware of the context is what I would say. And certainly if the client's talking about maybe taking their own life, then you're going to have to think of maybe a different way of strategizing and taking that information in the service of the client to help them. So generally speaking, intrusive thoughts are just part of being human, and we all have them.
We do. I think that was key. That was beautifully explained. If you are a member of our paid-for service, which is called the Counselling Study Resource, we actually have under behaviorism in our resource library some information on negative thoughts, some examples of those. So you're more than welcome to go through there. If you're wondering what is Counselling Study Resource, our paid-for service, well, more information on that is coming up in just a moment as we go into Practice Matters. And today, Practice Matters, we're looking at the emergency phone call that we, I guess, receive where a client is in deep distress and the phone goes. Rory, you're going to be speaking about working around that.
Yes, at the beginning I alluded to a blue light service, and by blue lights I'm meaning ambulances and police cars and fire engines. But in the UK here, they have blue lights that spin round and sirens. And as therapists, we're not a blue light service. We're not an emergency first responder service. What we are is we're a service which offers structured sessions throughout appointments where people would arrive on an agreed time, an agreed day, and work through their issues. So if we do get clients, and I guess kind of myself are in private practice, it doesn't happen often, but it's really useful to put that into the contract. So when you're contracting, even if you're working in an agency, to reflect to the client that these are fixed days that you're seeing the client. Yes, they can move if an appointment needs to be changed, but you can't see someone at the drop of a hat, as it were. And if you have a client who maybe needed other forms of support, it may be worth thinking about making a referral or thinking about other areas of support the client can offer. So when I worked for a charity, when I did my placement hours, I was very fortunate. The charity had lots of support in place. So if I was referred a client who said, I think I might need to speak to someone on a regular basis, then that could be put in place. But it was clear to the client it wouldn't be me. They couldn't phone the organisation up and speak to me outside our contracted time together. And it's really, really important. And one of the things that came up when me and Ken talked many years ago is that some placements give the students mobile phones. And I have a view on this that, if you've got a mobile phone and you phone a client up to book an appointment, if they're in crisis and they phone you back and the phone's not switched on, what is in place? What's in place for that client if the phone just rings and rings and rings? So, for people who do that, what we sometimes do is have an answering service that basically says this phone is not answerable at the moment. However, if you need support, please dial this number or some kind of contact, because it can happen. So a client may be in need, phone up, and there's nothing on the other end. Personally, I don't think it's good practice to give student counsellors mobile phones. I think everything should be done from the agency, and I don't think it's particularly useful for students to contact clients on their own phones. I need to make that point, because that can lead to all sorts of difficulties. Because if you're not at practice, you're sat maybe sitting having your evening meal, the phone goes and it's a client in crisis. How are you going to work with that? So, always, if you're having to phone a client, use the agency's phone, and that way they have to contact the agency, or at least they know where to get support. It's those things that sometimes aren't taught, I think, that can give us the biggest problems, Ken.
Hear you, and that just shows the depth of this subject. So let's go straight into this topic in depth with Rory in Practice Matters after this short message about our paid-for service, Counselling Study Resource.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Dealing with emergency phone calls. Mobile phones have dramatically changed how we communicate with each other and our clients. When I started my placement as a student in 2002, very few people owned a mobile phone, and all communication to clients was in the form of a letter or a phone call from the agency landline, usually to their home. 17 years on, and almost everybody owns a mobile phone, for which student counsellors can bring some very unexpected challenges. Counselling is a contracted activity, bound by the limits of confidentiality, ethics and boundaries, and sessions take place at arranged times negotiated between the client and the counsellor. We are not a blue light emergency service that can be called up like the police or the fire brigade or an ambulance 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. And just let me share with you some scenarios and the pitfalls of giving your clients your mobile phone number. So scenario one is you go to bed at night, you turn off your phone, and in the morning you switch on the phone to find your client has left a message saying they have taken an overdose and want you to help them. About this scenario, you are sitting in a restaurant preparing to have an evening meal when your client rings you and tells you they feel suicidal. The agency you work for is closed for the day and all the contact details you have is their phone number. Or what about this, scenario 3? Client phones you up out of the blue and wants a counselling session there and then and will not take no for an answer. You think these scenarios are far-fetched? Well, all the above have happened to therapists I know. So what is the best way of dealing with an emergency phone call? Well, first of all, assess what the client wants and see if it can be held until the next session. In other words, if a client does phone you up, try to work it so that they can see you in the next session. In cases where the client or a third party is in imminent danger, remember what you contracted for and the limits of confidentiality. And 3, consider your boundaries. State how much time you're willing to give to a phone call and make sure the client understands with this. Speak with the client at the next session and see if there's any external support they can access in a crisis, such as the Samaritans, the agency I work for, had a drop-in. So if clients were really struggling, they could drop in between counselling sessions. It's also essential that if you do get a phone call from a client, revisit the contract regarding when you're available. One final observation, most supervisors, tutors and placement managers would not agree with a student giving their phone number to a client. As we have observed, the risk is too great. So what's the best way of dealing with an emergency phone call? Well, perhaps not to receive them in the first place.
Thank you as always, Rory. A really important topic. And again, it's a topic we want to be considering long before it happens, before that phone does ring, before that client maybe misunderstands that we are available 24/7 for them because of the relationship that we've formed. Beautifully described that we are not an emergency service and that we need to put things in place right from contracting so that is clearly understood and have clear referral pathways. Thank you very much, Rory. And of course, you can get Rory's super duper handout. He makes a super duper handout for every single one of the Practice Matters segments, and they are free. And you can get that by going to our website, which is counsellingtutor.com. That's 2 L's in counselling. We're based in the UK. Counsellingtutor.com. Click on the podcast tab. Go to episode 107. That's today's episode. You'll get all of the show notes from today's episode. Any links to external resources that may support the topics that we're speaking about. From within that page, you can download Rory's super duper handout free of charge. You just pop in your email address. We will send that straight through to you. And of course, if you are a member of our paid for service counselling study resource, well, all those handouts have already been added to your handouts vault. So moving on to our last topic of today, and that is group supervision. Is it the same as one-on-one supervision, Rory? What differences are there?
Well, I think it's a different dynamic. Group supervision is useful in its own way. So just to be clear, one-to-one supervision is where you go to see your supervisor and discuss your casework, usually for 1.5 hours a month, which is what ethical bodies recommend. But group supervision is a slightly different dynamic. It's usually held in two ways. Sometimes in learning institutes, where you'll split off into two groups and your tutor will lead it, and sometimes in your placement, where someone from the placement, a therapist from the placement, will lead it. And group supervision is where practitioners come together to discuss their clients. And I think the advantage of group supervision is you're getting really a hive mind. In other words, you're getting lots of different views from different frames of reference, which could be so helpful. And how it's structured is you usually sit in a circle. There's usually a facilitator who's a qualified counsellor and hopefully a supervisor. And then they may ask for maybe within the hour, maybe 3 clients. So it's to be done in rotation. Bring 3 clients. One person brings 1 client. Another person brings another person brings a client, and then discuss what's going on with the client, how they're working with the client, and then the rest of the group can give respectful and well thought out observations. Can be really, really useful. If it's facilitated properly, you can learn absolutely so much. And here's the thing: there's a lot of awarding bodies which will allow you to use group supervision as part, not solely. You still have to see a supervisor, but part of your supervision hours. So that can be useful too. But I think the benefit of group supervision, certainly when I've been in it, is that you get many different views and observations, which is something you don't get when you're just working with one supervisor. So very, very useful, and something that a lot of placements now are asking students to do.
Yeah, and I guess just from a practical point of view, if you are attending group supervision with your placement, just have a chat with your tutor, your course leader, on how you evidence that against your supervised hours, because 1.5 hours of group supervision does not equal 1.5 hours of one-on-one supervision. So you just need to find out that you are recording that right, so you're not overclaiming on that. Great benefits in group supervision. And I guess there are also weaknesses in group supervision as well, and we always like to look at the balances of this. And one of the things we hear so often is the difficulties within the dynamics within the groups, or whether that be a PD group, whether that be the group of peers during study. We hear that coming up again and again and again. And be mindful that the same kind of dynamics can show themselves in group supervision. And it goes back to what you were saying, Rory, of how it is moderated. There's 2 sides to it. If it is moderated well and professionally, that should reduce that greatly. But we also need to look at ourselves. Whenever we have that topic come up of when I sit in PD group and such a person says something, it brings this up in me. Well, it's in you that is being brought up. We often need to look to self if we're feeling discomfort or if our emotions are changing in those group situations. So that's just something to bear in mind. I've been in both group supervision and one-on-one supervision. Great benefit of group supervision if you're working within an agency with a very specialized or specific client group, is you can talk about the client group as a whole, how that service is doing, and it really does give you an insight into working in a multidisciplinary team as opposed to working in isolation, which is kind of what we bring in to our one-on-one supervisors. And if you are working in an agency, there are times when you can bring agency issues up in that group supervision, and it can be kind of worked on in a hive mind, so you can get a little bit of managerial and therapeutic supervision, usually if it's being provided by the agency at some level.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And you're right to talk about the things that are the disadvantages, because certainly in early training, students may feel that they're a bit foolish. I can remember thinking when I was in my training circle a long time ago, thinking, I hope the tutor doesn't ask me, because I'm not sure that I know what I'm doing, and I'll be found out as a fraud and everybody will know that I'm not very good and I'll have to go and not come back. And the truth of the matter was, of course, when it was my turn, the tutor who was leading it facilitated it, and I actually discovered that I was doing better. I was more competent than I believed I was. So there was some learning. There was some great learning. I went away a bit more competent, a bit more with feelings of confidence, which was useful. And the other thing, of course, is that we work in the service of the client. So any form of disclosure we need to have in the contract. So I will talk in my contracts about having a supervisor. If it's group supervision, I would suggest that you talk about that as well, so people know exactly where their material is being discussed. It's just so important in the 100%. Service of ethics.
And I'm going to jump in, Rory. You suggest that, and I'm going to underline the suggest and kind of put in a much stronger word. Do it. It's not a suggestion. When you're speaking about your client's confidentiality, the client needs to know where that confidentiality boundary lies. It's part of our ethical obligation to this person in front of us. And I'm surprised sometimes that supervision of any kind is not mentioned when when boundaries are put in place and confidentiality is discussed. It may be where we need to break confidentiality, but you also need to be putting in there that you take elements of your practice to supervision, what that looks like, what is discussed at supervision. Do you mention names or do you not mention names? So that the client is aware of how their information is being used, and specifically group supervision, because you now have a potential of information that this client is sharing with a fellow human being, feeling that is completely in confidence, which could be spoken about in a group supervision. And if that should get back to that client in any way, shape or form, you are open to complaints procedures.
Yes, absolutely. So be sure of that. And also, I think one of the things that to be thoughtful of, and certainly when I trained, was that if your practice is in the same geographical areas where people live, there's a higher chance of people knowing in the group, knowing the client. And that certainly happened in my training circle. And I can remember many years ago sitting in the training circle, and there's one person who was absent that day. And the tutor said, right, Sarah, I'm just making that name up for confidential. It's right, Sarah, now you can share your clients. And it turned out that she had a client she wanted to share, but was known to one of my peers. And it was just happened that particular person was off that week. And we had to contract not to discuss it, which is an interesting dynamic. But that's the kind of thing that can happen. So we've always got to be thoughtful of confidentiality. I agree. I'm going to alter my word. I'm going to alter it. We're going to put a line through suggest. There's a line right through suggest. And it's essential. I'm going to put it with a B. I'm going to write it in big.
Yeah.
Essential that the client absolutely knows where their material is being discussed. It's just so fundamental.
It is. And Rory, you just brought something else. There's a lot to this, and I guess it can. The more people in the room, the trickier the dynamics can be at times. And I guess my final thought on this is group supervision contract, because you've just kind of mentioned there where a group supervision contract needed to be amended with one person missing. It really can be quite tricky, and I think a lot of work needs to be put into that group supervision contract and what that looks like as well. So you have your contract with your client, you have your contract with your supervisor, you have your group supervision contract. Wow, if I'd have known going into counselling training that there were so many contracts, Rory.
I know it really is tricky. I'm on final word. For those qualified colleagues who facilitate groups, they really do earn their money. Mm-hmm. They really do, because working with students, it can be very, very difficult. There's a lot of dynamics about how the student feels about talking about the client, how they feel about their own competencies. So there's so much in it. But what a fantastic episode today, Ken. We started off with working with intrusive thoughts, which we explored and had a look at. practice matters, why we're not an emergency blue light service. And then we finally finished off with what is group supervision. Just a great episode. And hey, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.